Nick, welcome. We're live. Excited to talk to you today because obviously I've been watching what's happening with Gamma and obviously BNS.BTC names, and it has been pretty crazy couple weeks. And I think you're one of the best people to actually talk about this topic. I've listened to a couple spaces that you put together. I really like the way you talk about these things, how you explain them, even to the average Joe, I would say, that everybody can really understand what NFTs are all about, what BNS names are all about. And so that's basically the topic of today's conversation. And so before we get into those topics, could you just briefly introduce yourself, who you are, what you're currently doing, what Gamma is all about, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thanks for having me. Always like to just chat about this kind of stuff. My name is Nick Sainato, co-founder and head of ops at Gamma.io. We're an NFT marketplace and kind of increasingly Web3 social platform. That's kind of the longer-term goal. And we kind of have three core pillars to our platform. Number one being our open marketplace, which you can kind of think about similar to an OpenSea, but for Bitcoin NFTs on stacks. The second is our creator tooling, so the ability for creators or artists who are non-technical to be able to launch smart contracts that they own in a few minutes. And then the third is that social component that I mentioned. It kind of ties together creators and collectors in a Web3 native way. That actually ties in nicely to some of this BNS stuff that's been going on, which was not necessarily the number one goal, but it is definitely a core integral component of that.
This is great. And I mean, obviously, I would even say past 2 weeks have been crazy. There's so many topics that are related to you guys, right? It's not only BNS and kind of the hype around it and people coming in and discovering this new thing, but also what's happening with the royalties, right? Across all the marketplaces, this kind of chatter about is it good, is it bad? What should we actually do? And so there is a lot of love and hate. And so I think we can even talk about that a little bit. But I really want to touch on BNS because it's actually surprising to me because I know Trevor Owens, right? I know him pretty well. He's a very close friend of mine. And I was there when he kicked off the Stacks Ventures, the accelerator. And he was the first guy that told me about .btc, right? And I think I remember that I even got one .btc domain back in the days. Back in the days, it's a year ago. So it's not 10 years ago. So it's a year ago, but I got it and then I kind of forgot about it, right? I didn't really register millions of them, etc. And now we see that people actually do that. People actually getting in and trying to snag as many of them as possible because they kind of look at it, if this is going to blow up, if BTC is really going to stick around, and potentially if there's going to be BTC Web3 built on the top of BTC, then this could be really big. So could you just give us, again, for a person that maybe have never heard about .btc name, could you give us very short definition or introduction of what it actually is and why it's getting traction today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd say I'll give this kind of general definition that I view to apply to all Web3, as you might call it, decentralized identities. And I call this out just because I think there are different blockchains all have their own flavor of this. And I'm not trying to say that BNS is reinventing the wheel here by any means, but I think that it's really unique kind of iteration of decentralized identities and actually a very early iteration of them, which we can get into. So just to give the background, as you said, decentralized identities or Web3 domains, however you kind of look at them or want to use them, are a user-owned and blockchain-oriented version of a Web2 kind of a .com. So you might have something like Google.com. You could similarly have Google.btc or Google.eth. And these decentralized identities can be used for a number of things. That core example of the .com versus the .btc is actually the one that I think is lacking the most right now, just simply because a lot of the browsers that we use don't natively support resolving these domains properly. So right now, when you go on Chrome or Firefox or Safari, you can type in google.com, and really what that's doing, there is list of IP addresses somewhere that correlate to these human readable names. And when you type in google.com, your browser is basically doing that work behind the scenes to say, okay, hey, DNS, which is domain name system for Web 2, where is this name actually pointing to, what IP address? And then it goes and does that. So on the Web 3 side for .btc, for example, you're taking what is not a very human readable address, similar to an IP address there, of a Bitcoin or a Stacks address or an Ethereum address, and you're giving it this like human readable version of that you can actually identify with. So that's kind of number one. But as I said, I think we're a little bit ways away, probably a few years before we have a really seamless operation there where you can just go to Google Chrome, type in somebody's name .btc and have it resolved to a website. The second is probably the easiest and most surface level, which is just your literal identity. So why does google.com want google.com? Because it's memorable. It's a brand. It's easy to remember. It's easy to type in. And that's no different for these domain names. It's in some ways, there's already some value just to that. You can think of it like a Twitter handle. There are people who pay lots of money just for the vanity of a Twitter handle. And we know that there's no utility outside of vanity in that regard. Yes. But I think there's like three other elements to decentralized identities that you gain in Web 3 that you don't have in Web 2. The first is this super simple single sign-on. So when you go to, not to continue the Google example, but it is a good one. When you go to log in to various applications, maybe you're going to any old website that says log in with Google, that's a single sign-on. And instead of having to have a separate login for that, you can just click sign in with Google, and that's a single sign-on for that. What these decentralized identities do is they actually serve as a single sign-on for different applications on Web3. So any application that supports a decentralized identity, you can actually log in with that, which resolves to your wallet. And then everything that you do on that application will be associated with your wallet, and you'll actually own a lot of that data. That's kind of the promise of Web3. So that's the first. The second is the ease of sending payments. Yeah. So this is a pretty straightforward one that you can do today even on blockchain wallets. You can, instead of typing in this 39BXY4 crazy long hash, you can instead just put in nick.btc, which I don't own. I wish I did. But,
I was about to ask.
Yeah, you can just put in that there and you can use it to send payments, to send NFTs, which is something we support on Gamma, or various other things that you want to transfer to somebody. And then the third, I think, is really the strongest in terms of the promise of Web3, which is censorship resistance and decentralized settlement and kind of like provenance of your ownership of this name. So to not get super in the weeds, the information that is transacted on a blockchain, so the fact that I've registered a new domain name or I've transferred it to you, that is going to be settled on a blockchain with varying degrees of decentralization depending on the way that blockchain works. And what that means is varying degrees of kind of a distributed network of lots of different people who are validating that this transaction did occur and did occur in the way that it was promised to have occurred. And I think this is one area where BNS names or .btc names really shine because they ultimately resolve and settle onto Bitcoin, which is the most decentralized, the most secure, the most trusted settlement layer for assets. And so as we look to the future and think about what is the value of google.com, it's priceless, but if we were to put a price tag on it, it's likely in the billions of dollars. You want that provenance, that ownership record to be settled by like bedrock. Like you don't want that to be contested. You don't want that to be questioned. And I think that that final piece there is a real strength to BNS.
Actually, I would like to unpack a couple of those points that you mentioned. The first one, you mentioned the decentralized identities, right? And I think it's interesting, right? But obviously, I think from the user experience and even from the blockchain perspective, there is still a lot of work to be done, right? Because I can imagine on one hand that, yes, it's a very good promise to control all the data, etc., but that's probably not going to be the case, right? There's going to be some sort of intermediaries that will kind of serve as like a trusted storage or something. I don't know even how to call it, right? In a sense that like you probably don't want to end up in a situation. And I was in one space recently and they were talking about these things. You basically don't want to end up in a situation that you completely control your identity. You connect to a website that is compromised and now like you end up being wiped out, right? Your money or whatever. And then like you have nobody to call, right? To resolve the issue. And so I believe that's one thing that is kind of against the fully decentralized identity that will probably be solved by having some sort of intermediary, or there's going to be certain data that necessarily doesn't have to be fully owned by you as a person, but can be done in a different way. But at the same time, I think the promise that if I'm logging into websites or into applications with this .btc or .whatever name, and I can actually choose what kind of information those applications have access to, then it's actually amazing, right? Because that's the problem that we're dealing with today in Web 2 in the traditional world. We always hear about these applications, these companies trying to get the data that they don't necessarily need for you to have a great experience. And they're reselling it and this, and we have these scams and we have these kinds of problems with Facebook, whatever you name it. And so I think that there is a lot of these arguments, but these real things that can be solved, right, by having this infrastructure, right? And so I'm definitely super bullish on that we're going in the right direction. One thing that I would ask you, and that's more, it's still connected to this, but it's also on the blockchain side. It's like, how do we solve the problem of if we have 1 billion people that are using this, right? And they will generate huge amounts of data. How do you solve the problem that you probably don't want everything to be stored on Bitcoin because there's too much that would be too expensive, right? How do you solve that issue? Is it with layer 1, layer 2, other solutions? Is it like stripping down the data into the core and then just like putting that one core piece into the blockchain, Bitcoin blockchain? How is this currently talked about or thought about?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really important call out, especially as we look to, as you mentioned, like 1 billion users, not just where we are now or even where we'll be in 6 months from now. There is ultimately only so much block space in each block that you're trying to settle. And so you really only want to store like the absolute, like most critical information on the blockchain. There are better purpose-built solutions for storing larger amounts of data. So I can actually give an example of the way that NFTs work, for example, that people may not actually realize this, but like much of what you see visually as an NFT is not actually stored directly on the blockchain. It's stored, hopefully in decentralized means, but not directly on the blockchain. So I'll give the example of one of our contracts that you could deploy from our creator portal today. If I'm a creator and I go and let's say I have 10 artworks that I've created and I'm going to upload them, where are they being uploaded? There are several leading solutions for this, but right now the most popular one, or at least one of two that are most popular, is called IPFS. It actually is a little bit silly, but it stands for Interplanetary File System. The idea with IPFS, it actually works somewhat similar to the way that like torrenting used to work. If you went on like LimeWire or something and you wanted to download a file, it's basically allows anyone to store a copy of that file. Maybe only one person is storing a copy of that file, but hopefully many people are storing a copy. And then when somebody wants that file, they basically raise their hand and they say, I'd like this file, please. And then the IPFS network goes and kind of asks around all the different computers that are running one of their nodes and storing files, and ultimately it finds the file and it produces. That's not stored on the blockchain. Like, as I mentioned, it's decentralized in that there's lots of different people that can store a copy of the file, but it's a much more scalable infrastructure for storing large amounts of data because anyone can just say, hey, I'm going to open up a Google Drive and store a copy and allow it to be accessible. And there we go. Now we have another copy of these files being stored. And it can be pretty low cost too because it's not like prized block space. But you might ask, like, then how does that remain what they call immutable, which is another core tenet of the blockchain, which is essentially means it can't change, it can't be censored, it can't be turned off. So once you now have those files in IPFS, they generate, without getting technical, a string of random letters and numbers that represent those files and those files only. If you try to change the files, that string of letters and numbers also changes. So even as a creator, I can't go in and change that without breaking the link between where those files are actually stored. So that link cannot be severed. And now I can take this link and I can put it somewhere that is immutable. So if I take that link and I put it inside an NFT smart contract, which is basically the application that manages the NFTs, we can say the images for this NFT are housed at this link. It can't be changed. If I try to change the files, that link will break. If I delete the files, that link will break. And anyone else could store a copy of those files, like even you as the buyer could store a copy of those files. And you can be sure that it will live on, hopefully beyond you. But then if we go one layer deeper, which is the final layer, I know I'm getting in the weeds here, then you need to say, how do you know that this NFT smart contract is immutable and has been secured in a decentralized way? And much in the same pattern where you're kind of taking this representation, these like lower and lower, you have these layers of abstraction, and then you can kind of remove those layers of abstraction. Now you can store the transaction outcome and many transaction outcomes in the case of the Stacks blockchain into a single hash, a single set of letters and numbers, where you can essentially do math to provably know that this transaction, this creation of these NFTs in the smart contract had been created. That single piece of information can be stored on the Bitcoin blockchain. So you can see like we've now gone down from probably gigabytes of information down to maybe a megabyte or a couple hundred kilobytes of information, now down to very small amounts of data. And that is what we're actually storing on the settlement layer. And that is something that is inherently scalable in that even if block space becomes very expensive, we can just add additional layers of abstraction, kind of boiling many transactions down into one hash and then settle the outcome of that.
Totally understand. So just to be like devil's advocate here for a little while, right? So I think what you just mentioned is very clear to me. But on the other hand, it feels like the IPFS, it's still kind of very much centralized, or not maybe centralized in a way, but it's something that could potentially get shut down, right? In a sense, because somebody needs to operate IPFS service. Is that correct? Or does it work in a different way?
Yeah, not necessarily. There is no central entity that that is running IPFS. There are people who are developing it further to make sure that it continues to improve. But I think the idea here is it allows a set of files that are increasingly valuable to become increasingly decentralized. So let's give an example of like Bored Ape Yacht Club. If Bored Ape Yacht Club is stored on IPFS, when the project launches, there may be a single copy, or there may be like 2 or 3 copies total. So maybe the creator is storing a copy, maybe OpenSea is storing a copy, and maybe one other party is storing a copy for fun or something like that. So you have 3 copies. Now, as a government or as even like an attacker, I could go and like try to sever those 3 links, and now all those files are gone, and like poof goes Bored Ape Yacht Club. But the nice thing here is that anyone with a vested interest in Bored Ape Yacht Club's files continuing on can just download a copy of those and host their own version of it. And now you have 5 copies, and then you have 10 copies, and then you have
Nick,
50
when
copies.
you say totally get it, just want to jump in here, make it very clear. So when you say store and host a copy of it, does it mean that me as a user, let's say, okay, I will buy a Bored Ape and I want to support, let's say, the decentralization of the IPFS infrastructure. So do I need to log in somewhere, set up my server, virtual server, upload the picture or whatever it is, and basically that's the way how I can contribute to this? How does this work?
Yeah, so just to be clear, and I don't know if you were saying this, but you wouldn't need to buy a Bored Ape to do this. Like, this is like totally permissioned.
Makes sense. Yeah.
If I go to, like, imagine if I just share you like a website link right now. Like, I'm just going to share you an article link. That link can now be accessed by anyone. Now, where that information at that link is being stored can be deleted at any time. And it's only held by one owner. The beauty of this is that the link that you can pass around, anybody can just scrape all those contents. And then, to get to your example, if I am technical enough, because there's a little bit of a technical understanding required to do it, I can then basically say, I'm going to download this contents as they exactly are, because remember, they have to remain exactly as they are, or else it won't end up at the same link. Now I can spin up an IPFS node, so run a little piece of software on my computer, and then tell it, here is where I'm storing my Bored Ape Yacht Club PFP photos. And now the IPFS network can basically, when somebody's raising their hand for those files, they can find me as one of the potential sources. And maybe it's based on geography, or maybe it's based on my connection speed. Ultimately, it will find me if it looks long enough.
Yeah,
there are other solutions like Arweave and other things. There's like varying degrees of complexity. So I won't get into like a whole nother example, but if you're interested, you can look into things like that as well.
No, but this is super interesting. Like, the reason why I was saying I will buy Bored Ape is because of the vested interest, right? Because I feel like it's still quite complicated. And I also believe that, and this is just like my gut feeling tells me that to really get the original file in the original kind of quality and the format that, let's say, is kind of a standard for what the Bored Ape Yacht Club as a company wants to have stored in the IPFS servers, it kind of needs to come from somewhere, right? Like, I cannot just store a PNG file and put it into IPFS and thinking that's the same, right?
No, it is.
Okay.
It is identical. So within the NFT smart contract, it has to point somewhere. And so it's pointing to the actual original source files. Now, there are some projects that say, we're going to make the higher res files like an unlockable that you have to own. But in the case of Bored Ape Yacht Club, that isn't the case. Like, the actual raw files are accessible on IPFS by anyone. And I think like this is a bit of an aside, but I think it's a valuable thing to call out, because I think people at this point probably would raise their hand and then I can just copy the original files, download them, and make my own Bored Ape Yacht Club. And this devolves into like a whole discussion on provenance and what is like real and whatnot. But like, I think the core thing to remember here is like, copyright is not like foregone by storing something in a public way. Like, I still, as a copyright owner, own what I create. Like, even if I don't say in big bold letters like, this is owned by Nick Sainato, like, copyright protects me regardless. And copyright laws are quite strong. And so you can't like get beyond the law by saying like, this was public and I just downloaded it and I took a copy of it. That being said, for projects that want to basically give away the copyright to their holders, there's a lot of really good solutions like that, like Creative Commons and being able to do something like CC0 licenses, or even like I'm a huge proponent of these brand new licenses by A16Z called the Can't Be Evil licenses. And you can basically have varying degrees of basically like permissions that you're giving away to people who want to use the artwork that you produce.
Yeah, totally makes sense. It's actually an interesting discussion. I mean, we got carried away a little bit, but I think it's a very interesting discussion. Maybe one more short comment on this. How do you think this space is going to evolve? Because what I have been noticing recently, for instance, with Moonbirds, right? So what they did, I think at the beginning it was IPFS as well, but now they said, hey, we're going to put it on chain. We want to have the artwork live on chain because we want Moonbirds to be around if Ethereum is around forever. And so do you think that we're basically going to see these two different directions? One of them is this more, let's say, scalable direction of IPFS that probably, yes, is more scalable and even cheaper. and then we're going to see projects or specific assets be stored in a way that are completely on chain?
Yeah, so I think that like a good way to think about this is not like that there's going to be two paths, but rather like the needs of each individual project or creator or whatever you might call it will determine the outcome. So to give like a silly example of this, if I have like a few quarters in my pocket, like I'm not really that worried about those quarters. So like I might store them by leaving them on the table. If I have like $100 bill, I might want to put that like in the bill pocket of my wallet because I don't want it to blow away. If I have $10,000, I might want to put it in a bank account so that somebody can't like come into my home and steal it. If I have $1 billion, I don't even trust just a regular old bank with that. Like I want like a Fort Knox or something. So I think that like as things become more valuable is when you actually make decisions like that. So moonbirds, for example, have become very exclusive and very valuable. And there are multiple vectors here. It doesn't have to be just valuable. It could even be just viewed as like something that is like culturally or historically important. And you want to like be sure that it is like stored on bedrock and not on something that, you know, even if IPFS had 100 different people that were housing this information, well, Bitcoin has thousands, so it's like an order of magnitude or more better. You can do that. What I will say is like that's not going to be accessible to most people.
Yeah.
I'm sure that storing Moonbird files on the Ethereum blockchain in their entirety probably costs like hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's right now. As more and more activity happens, it may cost millions or hundreds of millions of dollars to store like megabytes of information on the blockchain.
Again, it's a different topic that I wanted to discuss, and we're going to go back into the BNS. You know, I'm really curious when you say that it's hundreds of thousands and potentially millions of dollars. So how does this work? It's not just like a one-time quote unquote transaction that you pay the gas fee one time and it's just there because you don't change it. Why is it so expensive?
It is actually just like a one-time gas fee in this case, because you actually like, you wouldn't want maintenance on this. Like if there was maintenance, it kind of defeats the whole purpose of wanting it to be like there forever. You shouldn't have to pay ongoing maintenance fees because that relies on someone paying those fees. The reason that it costs so much money is because I'm not like a blockchain dev, so I probably can't explain this or even understand it to the degree like needed to really get in the weeds here. But like when you're storing the outcome of a transaction, that may be like a kilobyte of information, like or less, far less than a kilobyte, like a number of bytes. And so when you're trying to store images, like images are megabytes, even gigabytes if you're storing 10,000 of them. And so it's just a lot of information to settle. And on a blockchain, now every copy of that blockchain on thousands of computers forever need to now keep a copy of those Moonbird photos. Like it's kind of, I don't want to say that people shouldn't do it. Like that's exactly like the kind of like argument that kind of more toxic like Bitcoin maximalists have even towards stacks. Like, why are you building things on top of it? That's a complete like skewed way of using the blockchain. So I won't say that, but like it's not practical for every project to store 100% a gigabyte of information on the blockchain.
You're 100% right. It's not for everyone. And I would be really curious, like, to actually know the number. I don't know if Moonbirds are going to come out with the number.
Well, you'll be able to see it whenever.
Actually, yes, you can track it, right? You can go into the transactions and you can track the wallets and see how much gas they paid. But this is super interesting topic. But regardless, let's go back because actually, you know, I don't even think that we really carried ourselves too much away because BNS or these BTC domains, they're NFTs as well, right?
Yeah.
So I believe it's all connected. Obviously, it's a different type of projects, different type of information, but the idea behind it is exactly the same. And so we already talked about the decentralization and why the BNS names matter and what they can be used for. Right now, let's talk a little bit about why you think that right now we're seeing all these people kind of discovering .btc. And do you think that the hype is going to be sustained, or do you feel like we still need more work to be done to actually bring the masses and kind of help them understand like why this matters beyond just the branding and maybe just, okay, I want to own Nick.btc?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that like generally there's this like hype cycle with any new emerging technology or use case. And in the case of certain like iterations of a project or anything, you kind of have a hype cycle that looks like this where it peaks, then it literally goes down to zero and there's nothing ever again after that. But I think that when you have something that is like genuinely useful and like has several different components that could work. And as we kind of opened with, I think that like if any one of those 4 or 5 things that I mentioned were to take off, like in terms of mass adoption, then what we have here is something that's very valuable and very useful. If 2 or 3 or all of them are to become adopted, which in my opinion they will, then we have something like magical. Like this is like a like iPhone moment where this is like just changes the game completely. But like to reiterate, I think like the fact that these are so useful in so many different ways and there are so many people that are starting to see that and therefore building different applications and tools for other developers to do that and make use of these is like a good bullish long-term signal in my opinion.
Yes, I totally agree. I think there is a bunch of these bull cases or examples why this matter. And obviously you mentioned a couple of them, but to me, what is the most exciting thing here is the payments, right?
Yeah.
I know you mentioned about it at the very beginning, but I just kind of want to get back to it or reiterate, because if really Bitcoin is going to become what I would say not only the maxis, but kind of the general community, I would say, of believers say that Bitcoin is going to be the money, right? The new currency that we're going to use day to day, transferring value, buying things, etc., businesses, individuals, you name it, governments, right? Then ultimately the user experience, as you mentioned, of like copy pasting some complicated addresses and stuff, that's just not going to be viable. But if you can have Nick.btc or Coca-Cola.btc or maybe Starbucks.btc, then makes sense that it's just going to be much better for the end user, right? So this is something that I'm personally just super bullish. I think there is, and we can talk about it now as well, the problems and where you think the improvement needs to come from, because I think there is still a lot of problems that we have to solve, because right now, it's still a fairly complicated process to get the .btc name, right? Yeah. It's not as on Ethereum, you set up a MetaMask, you have one wallet and you can buy unlimited amount of them. You just need to have Ethereum, right? What you need to do with .btc, you need to set up a new wallet, you need to get stacks, and then you cannot even buy more than one with one address, right? Wallet address. You need to set up multiple accounts. And so those are the things that I believe are really kind of blocking the general, I don't want to say general public, but I would say the general, I would say Web3 audience to really get on it, right? And so can you comment on that? Is this something that is in the works? Because I believe that you're also in some of the working groups that are kind of trying to improve this whole protocol, the standards, etc. So what is currently in the works and what can we expect down the road?
Yeah, so I think that the good and maybe slightly bad news here, but it's generally good, is that like BNS is truly decentralized. Like it is, I've given this little fun fact in Twitter spaces and things, so you've heard this before, but the actual BNS smart contract is not owned by anyone. It's actually owned by like a null address, like a burn address, which means that like there is no person that can have like admin control, even if there were admin functions on the contract. And the fun fact here is that it's actually owned by can'tbeevil.stacks. So it's a BNS in itself, and can't be evil is kind of that like Bitcoin slogan of kind of fighting back at Google, who had their saying for the longest time of don't be evil, forget don't be evil, which they seem to have dropped that, which kind of is the irony in that. Yes. You literally can't be evil with Bitcoin and with BNS. So that's a gift and a curse, because The gift there is that you truly cannot be censored by anyone. You truly cannot be stopped from using your domain in the way that you want to use it. But the downside to that is that there's no one like directly responsible for its advancement and its progression, except for all of us, the community, and individual entities like Gamma. And so for a while, when there was interest but not like crazy hype over BNS, we even were a bit kind of like complacent in spending the time to make like a very intricate custom solution for the current iteration of BNS. As you described, you can only have one per address. It makes the user experience quite rough. It makes it very hard to build something like a marketplace on top of it. It's not to say it's impossible. Actually, one of another NFT marketplace in the space can happily give credit where it's due. Like they had made a NFT marketplace for it back months and months ago, but it never took off. I think because like it's just a lot of friction there. I think that we did some things really like sitting down thinking about, okay, if we are going to move forward with this, how can we make it the best experience possible given the limitations? And I think that we did significantly improve that like base first experience that we saw, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. That being said, like similar to the IPFS thing, to kind of take it full circle there, anyone with a vested interest in BNS succeeding, which now is not thousands of people, but is tens of thousands of people, and hopefully hundreds of thousands of people, and millions of people, I won't just stop there. There are now more people that hopefully will want to see this like be made into the user experience that it needs to be. So as you mentioned, myself and Jamil, who is our CEO and founder of Gamma, are on a working group that is kind of trying to put together a proposal. Again, it's not our like infinite wisdom or decision here. This is purely like we know how to build in this space, and so we're going to give it our best attempt at a proposal. And basically then we're going to hand it off to the community and say like, do you like what we've proposed, or how would you change what we proposed? And then it's going to go through a formal, what's called a SIP process, a Stacks Improvement Proposal, which if for those interested can read about that process. It's done in a very decentralized way. Apologies if you can hear that. There's
a little bit, but it's all right. It's all right. No worries, man.
They can kind of work to improve that. So as I said, a gift and a curse a little bit, but there are a lot of people, including myself, that are like wanting to see this become easier to work with.
Awesome. And so just a follow up on that. So how does it work today? So it's fully decentralized and understood that no one entity controls it, but the community controls it. So what does it mean in terms of really submitting the proposals, making sure that enough people get behind it or actually vote on the proposals? Because this is one of the biggest problems of any kind of DAO or community-owned thing today, right?
The way that the SIP process works that I mentioned, the Stacks Improvement Proposal process, is it's like designed kind of similarly to the IPFS example in a way that like can become increasingly decentralized as more and more people are interested in joining that like civic process. And so right now there are a number of, they call them CABs, community advisory boards. I'm on one of those CABs, the diversity CAB. There's an ethics CAB. There's a technical CAB, of course. There's an economics CAB. And so all of these CABs basically review proposals from the community. Anyone can submit one. And basically they can step in and say, this is a quality proposal, this is not a good proposal for these reasons, go back to the drawing board and come back with another iteration on this. And then they basically are like the first step to say, like, we're not saying that this deserves to be a SIP or not, we're just saying like that it has met like the minimum bar for being like a quality proposal.
Okay.
And then it kind of goes to the next step and then the next step and then the next step. And so there are several steps in the process. I don't want to get in the weeds now on how it works.
How long does it take, let's say, if you submit a proposal and you're supposed to go through all these steps and you are successfully going through these steps, how long does it take to really take the proposal to acceptance and then after that maybe make a change to the protocol or to the smart contract or whatever you're actually changing eventually?
So I think like we don't have that much precedent because Stacks is a pretty new blockchain. I think there are like 18 or 19 SIPs total, and like 10 of them were made like right away. So we've only had like a number of these go through. I think some of these have gone through in like a year. Other of these have gone through, I think like the quickest one was like 4 or 5 months. But that doesn't even mean that that's the quickest possible. It just means it's the quickest that we've seen so far. I think that like overwhelming community support is a really strong factor in getting it to advance, because this is like, these committees are only in place to represent the interests of the community. Like me being on the diversity cab, like it's not my job to say, I don't like this. It's only my job to say this like hinders accessibility for this type of user, and therefore it is a dangerous addition to the protocol. And that's going to be like a pretty like high bar to breach. So I think that the best thing that everyone can do is like rally behind really pushing for this. And if there are like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people that are like, we want this tomorrow, like, no, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but like, it'll probably happen in a couple months and not in a year.
Awesome. No, this is great. And obviously we're still pretty early. As you mentioned, Stacks has not been around for too long. I guess it's like a year or maybe year and a half, right? And BNS basically started coming to light just recently, right? So I think we're still at the very beginning. And what I always say, and actually I learned that from somebody and I forgot who was the person who said this or who I should quote on this, but I really like that kind of ideology whenever you're, let's say you're an investor or you're somebody who wants to put your effort behind something. Always do it when things are not perfect, right? Because that's the exact perfect time to do something, because the upside is the biggest, right? Obviously, could go in a different direction and it will not work out. But if it does work out, then you are there early enough to see that real upside from that, right? So I'm really big fan of this. And speaking of things not working out, right? I really want to touch on this. So what is the bear case here in terms of what could go wrong? So why I'm asking this is because .BTC is just amazing, right? And there can only be one .BTC. And right now it's built on Stacks blockchain. What if in 3 months or 6 years, Stacks is not around and this thing disappears? What happens to .BTC, this protocol, this technology itself? Can it be migrated, or what is kind of the bear case here? What is the kind of downside?
Yeah, so this is like not literally fun thought experiment because it's a negative outcome, but I actually enjoy kind of like thinking through this because it actually highlights the very reason why I believe in settling information on Bitcoin as the oldest. It's just been around for the longest. It's gone through the most storms and has weathered all of them and is still the top dog, at least as of late. And even if not the number one cryptocurrency by market cap, it is certainly the most decentralized. So the kind of beauty here is that it really probably in hindsight was perfect that we went through the whole IPFS thing, because it is the perfect example. Like anyone with a vested interest in BNS continuing can keep a copy of the Stacks blockchain so they could run a node themselves. And the kind of like really beautiful thing here is that let's say Stacks does like cease to be, like no one is willing to mine another block. Like they don't feel that receiving Stacks token is worthwhile, like return on investment for their Bitcoin, and they're not interested in continuing the blockchain. If anyone, any single person, and I always like the example of like, assuming all parties are liars, which you kind of have to do. If you just have one copy of the Stacks blockchain, you can actually go back and confirm that a transaction occurred, and therefore that every transaction occurred exactly the way it occurred, using only the Bitcoin blockchain and that single copy of the Stacks blockchain. And so this is really powerful because you basically can then start up a completely new blockchain and make these assumptions that you know to be true because you're trusting in Bitcoin and its settlement. And you can say, okay, we know that the state up until this point is exactly this. And by the way, like that might sound a little weird, but it's not all that different from like the Ethereum merge where they've switched from proof of work to proof of stake. They literally just said, we're going to pause blockchain state right here, and we're going to fork over to this other different blockchain, which is proof of stake, assuming that everything that happened in the past happened exactly the way that it happened. So that's why I like love the fact that Stacks builds on top of Bitcoin, but settles the outcome onto the Bitcoin blockchain.
Since you touched on this point that you just need one entity or you need one block, so does it really mean that you literally just need one person that will want to continue this thing, who understands how to make this work, and then you just continue? It's maybe not going to be called Stacks, the underlying blockchain underneath, or the protocol underneath that is going to be kind of guarding the .btc names and everything related to that, all the transactions and who owns what, and it can just continue. So that's basically what you're saying. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, effectively. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like that simple. Like this would be like a major change that would impact so many people, and like the new version would hopefully have to be like fixing the problems of the first version, because I'm sure it got there for some reason. But yeah, effectively everyone can be liars as long as there's a copy. And just to say the flip side of that, if the copy that you're proposing was not valid, you could also confirm that using just the Bitcoin blockchain. Now, I do say, and I will say, this is one like risk vector, is that you do need one legitimate copy, like just one, but you do need one legitimate copy, because if you like, because we've like gotten rid of those layers of abstraction that I mentioned, just the hash of like random letters and numbers on the Bitcoin blockchain is not enough to know that a BNS name is registered. But with a single legitimate copy, you can validate the entire chain state using just the Bitcoin blockchain.
Makes total sense. Sorry, I cut you off there in the middle. Do you know the point that you wanted to touch on?
Yeah, so just to bring it full circle to your like original question, like right now it's on Stacks, and maybe like it might not be in the future. I certainly hope it is, and I'm bullish on it being on Stacks in the future. But let's suppose that Stacks does die. We have some precedent for this, and it's actually a little bit of fun history of why BNS exists on Stacks today. I'm probably going to slightly butcher the exact timeline of events, but like to paraphrase, there were multiple iterations of decentralized identity on Bitcoin, or on layers on top of Bitcoin as well, like as early as like 8-10 years ago. And like fun fact here again about Stacks is the first iterations of Stacks, which went by a different name, it was Stacks, and then before that it was Blockstack, and then there was one name, and before that, the original intent was decentralized identities on Bitcoin and being able to like have this user-owned internet where the identity is yours. And actually, I think like as frustrating as it is to have like one name per address, that's actually like a relic of that history, because the idea was like, you are one person, you only have one identity. It was made with good intentions, but I think we've seen that the user experience of that is quite poor, and you as one person may have 5 different identities that you go by. You might affiliate in many different ways. So Munib, who is the founder of Stacks, he believes he has the oldest decentralized identity still in existence on any blockchain. And it is made possible through an event that you described, where a prior failed iteration of a decentralized network of names or system of names had failed and was tried over on Stacks. And his provenance was basically his ownership record, and the history of that was provable by Bitcoin, and therefore was able to be recreated on Stacks, and he remains its true owner. That's like a powerful case study, and like a perfect one here of like why it's so important to settle this on Bitcoin. Like imagine if that information was settled on any of the number of other coins that had popped up in the ICO phase of like 2017, 18, 19. It may no longer be exactly.
This is actually a great point. And I know we're kind of like on time already. You mentioned a really good point, which is it's a decentralized identity. And actually, ultimately, for many reasons, you want to have only one identity per person, right? You don't want to have too many because that's the problem that we see with the bots on Twitter today, right? Yeah. And this is actually interesting because, yes, it's not easy to register many of them if you are a trader. If you just want to invest and you want to trade, you want to flip, then obviously there is this hurdle compared to Ethereum and ENS. But when you really think about the use cases, and I actually think Twitter is an amazing use case, right? Just imagine, and I know you're a big fan of Elon as well and Tesla. Just imagine that Elon takes over Twitter, and he has mentioned many times in the past that he wants to bring blockchain and payments onto Twitter, right? And I could very easily imagine that there could be some sort of connectivity with Bitcoin, with .BTC names for payments, Lightning transactions, etc., and even kind of using that to get rid of the bots, right? Because you would have to be somewhat verified, and you want to make sure that every person just have one identity. Or if you want to set up multiple accounts, there would be another workaround. You would have to verify yourself that it's still tied to that specific person and identity. Otherwise, it's considered a bot, right? So I actually think that this use case may not be great right now because it's not a great user experience for many people that want to buy a lot of them. But for solving other issues, it could be amazing. So probably we don't want to get rid of it completely. Maybe we want to have both.
Yeah, I think like I kind of disagree with that. Okay. And for those who like are curious on my elaborate thoughts that are quite boring, you can look at the discussion on the Stacks forum about BNS improvements and the one name per address. But like I basically rattled off like 6 or 8 reasons why I just absolutely disagree with this one name per address. Yes, a couple of those reasons include this idea of like being able to speculate on the future and trade these things more easily. But there are actually a lot of other reasons too, like just to give like one or two, even in the realm of identity, there are people like Ryder that is working on this idea of social handles. And so you may, instead of having .btc, one of the things that BNS allows you to do is register other, they call them namespaces, which are effectively different domain endings. So your .com in Web 2 is always going to be the king, but you may have .xyz or other endings that pop up for specific reasons. And Web 3 being so social, you can have Bored Ape Yacht Club or something like that, or maybe some shortened version of that. And now if I want to like signal my affiliation or support with that brand, I can get nick.bayc or something like that and like signal my support. Now, that might be what I want to signal on Discord, but it might not be what I want to signal when I'm receiving payments, or it might not be what I want to signal when I'm going to my portfolio or something like that. So I think like that's one example of like, it's almost like reductive to say like, you are just nick.btc and nothing else. Like, no, I'm a complex being, like I'm many things.
No, totally, Nick. Actually, and I fully agree. I think my point that I was trying to make was slightly different. I wasn't saying that you can only have one address and that's where it ends. It's more just the process of acquiring that address, right? It should be somehow controlled, especially if we're really talking about payments, if we're talking stuff that you don't want to just mess around, right? Like, or even Twitter, like just using that example of Twitter with the bots, like you want to have a verification, right? So you want to make sure that there is one point that you can point towards to make sure that you are a real person, right? Yeah. And if you have like subsequent or like different like other domains that are tied to that specific identity or that name, or if you have multiple names and they're both verified in a different way, I think that's totally fine. And obviously, yes, we want to have a different ways of kind of being able to communicate and being able to do things that we like to do. But I was more kind of concerned about the verification there and kind of like, you don't really want to allow people to have 20, 50 different things and not having any kind of sense of control, because then it basically played, right, by hackers or anyone, bots and stuff like that. So that was the point. I'm not sure if I'm explaining it clearly, but that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, like I think this is like an area where like the blockchain is really like the perfect place for this to occur, because for something like verifying if you're a bot, like having many domains or no domains doesn't, it may be like one signal that you're real, but you can like tell that you're a real person in a lot of ways. Like for example, if at this one address that I'm holding 100 names, you'd be like, you might be a bot, you have 100 names, none of them are like a real name, they're like random letters and numbers, like who knows. I can look back on your blockchain history and be like, you own a moonbird, you interacted with a governance process, some DAO voting for XYZ, you transacted with a bunch of friends sending payments back and forth. Like you can tell that somebody is real purely based on their blockchain history. And then the applications can even do things kind of creative in that way. Like one thing I'd love to see used more often, and I think probably will happen over time, is kind of like that thing that banks do when they're trying to prove that you own another bank, where they say, we've made 2 random deposits of like a penny and 3 pennies. We need you to tell us those amounts. Now, you wouldn't want to just do that because anyone could tell those amounts. It's public. But what you could do is you could say, send us 1 penny and we'll send it back to you. Or we'll send you a penny and you send it back to us. Like it's not about the money. It's more about the proving that you own that address. You can do that, and an app can basically say, to prevent a bot, it could do it in the ways that we already prevent bots with CAPTCHAs and things. It could say, first solve a CAPTCHA. Now that I've proven that you're human, now I'm going to send you some Bitcoin, a very small amount, and I want you to send it back to me. And basically, you've now done this like key-based style 2-way proving of ownership, and you've proven that you're a real person. So it's like, I think there are like many ways to solve for this, that like this gets to like something that I feel as someone who is, yes, I'm technical enough to be able to talk about these things, but I'm not a developer. Like I'm a non-technical person. I'm on the ops side of Gamma, and my background is in digital marketing, SEO, paid media. What I want to see is more marketers, more product designers, more UX designers find their way into Web3, because when you start to have like these, like in hindsight, like obvious ways to like solve for things like this and kind of get out of the like developers just want to build like technically impressive things, which we need that too, but like they're not perfect at everything. They're good at building. They're good at making sure things are secure. They're good at making sure things are scalable. We need like these creative thinkers and these like
for sure
these people who are thinking about UX to meld together. And I think we're starting to see that, but we're early. So, you know, it'll take a little bit of time.
Awesome. And Nick, one last quick question. So we have been talking about .btc names. Tell me your favorites and tell me, because obviously we have seen the digits and they blew up on Ethereum, and now people basically, you cannot register anymore any 3-digit, 4-digit on BTC because they're all gone. So what are your personal favorites in terms of some sort of categories that are still underrated, that you can still get and maybe people are not paying too much attention to it? What do you personally like?
So I hate to get into like speculation here, because I do think it can like devalue the very like legitimate use cases that we've described over this call. But I will entertain this and say, like, I think that like the reason that digits have taken off is probably like, at least largely in my opinion, twofold. Number one, they are like inherently exclusive and limited. Just mathematically only so many of them. So if you're trying to like mimic this like very just like what is something that's rare, it's like a good, easy to understand example of that. And then I think the second reason is it like very closely mimics what the popular NFT projects of are the day with like, you know, you have Bored Ape Yacht Club, to keep saying it again and again. There's 10K. Now you have 4 digits. There's 10K. Like it's like a very relatable thing for like your NFT bro that like is interested in that kind of a thing. In my opinion, those will probably for a long time or maybe always be this like exclusive club just because that's what they've become. And I think that any social club, any community of any kind, like, is only valuable because people want to be there. And if you have this like-minded group of people that all believes in digits, like, then digits are valuable. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's just like, it's a social convention. But I think that, like, longer term, in my opinion, I'm more bullish on, like, people's first names, brands, things that are popular and expensive in Web 2. Like, when we wanted to buy Gamma.io, we spent more than 1 Bitcoin on that at today's prices. But it's worth it because that's our brand and we want to, like, align with that, and we can, we want it to be memorable and we want people to, like, type in something and find us easily. So it's like, there's a perfect example of, like, we were willing to pay a lot of money for that. That will be no different, in my opinion, in the future when these big companies or even just, like, rich people want their name. They want to, like, flex that brand as their own. I do think there are some concerns in terms of, like, accessibility, and it probably will shut out, like, people with less money from being able to register or like, acquire those. But I think to some extent, like, the market will determine that, and there's not too much we can do to prevent that from happening. What we can do is foster other, like, namespaces, for example, like I mentioned, where maybe I couldn't get Nick.btc, and that's, like, the ultimate flex, but I could get Nick.btc, no different than, like, an email address or a Twitter handle, or I can get Nick.gamma or something like that. That is not to say we're registering .gamma. I'm just using an example.
I'm actually with you. Like, I feel, obviously, yes, the 10K clubs, these 3 digits, 4 digits, they will have the place in the community, and why they're so exclusive, because it's so Web3 and, as you said, limited amount. But if we talk about mass adoption, right? If we really talk about having 1 billion people using this, and if we have Bitcoin becoming really not only the store of value, but actually a currency, or something that we use every single day to transact, to exchange value, then, we're really talking about a lot of people that will want to have not necessarily super exclusive, not Nick.btc, but they will at least want to have something that they can remember, something that is easier to just live with day to day. And so I'm also pretty bullish on that. So, man, tell me, do you own Tesla.btc? Who owns it?
No, I don't know who owns Tesla.btc. I could probably dig into it. I do actually know who owns TSLA.eth. I know who owns that. But yeah, I wish I did. I think it's, like, one of those fun things of, like, being able to, like, flex. Like, I was the earliest person that got that.
Yes, totally.
Or I spent some crazy amount of money to acquire it. But we'll see if Tesla one day wants to acquire it and offers some crazy amount of money for it.
Yeah, let's see, man. Good luck to those that had that foresight. And if this works out, then good for them, right? Because, we're still very early. And those people that got these kinds of brands and these names, they were even earlier than us. So if we as a collective win, then they deserve to win even more. But Nick, it has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. We discussed a lot of different topics that I think are really important for people to pay attention to. And so I'm super excited for this interview to come out. One last thing, how can people find you? How can people connect with you if they want to learn more about Gamma, yourself, if they want to get involved with BNS, they want to join the groups? What is the best way to find you, connect with you, DM you? Tell us more.
It's my name, which might be a little hard to spell, at Nick Sainato, Sainato. Similar, I'm there at .btc.eth at that same address. Of course, you can find me on Discord and all the other millions of apps that Web3 has decided wants to distribute communications across. But yeah, I would say if you want to take a look at my Gamma profile and some of the NFTs that I have, you can go to my, not really even pseudonym, but just silly name that I use, which is vanillabean.btc. So if you go to gamma.io/vanillabean.btc, you can see that, and there's links to my Twitter and whatnot there as well.
Awesome, Nick. Thanks so much once again, and be in touch. Super excited to see what you guys are going to build in the BNS space, but also with Gamma.